You're a loser, you're a coward, you are nobody, you're an animal.
In the summer of 1982, Green River was just another quiet stretch of water in Washington state. In King County, near the International Airport, an area of highway referred to as Strip became the focal point. On July 15, 1982, the body of 16-year-old Wendy Lee was found floating in the water, strangled to death. At first, it seemed like a horrifying coincidence, one victim, then another. But as the numbers grew, it became clear this was the work of a serial killer. Over the next few months, more women would disappear, mostly runaways, sex workers, and vulnerable young women from Seattle and surrounding areas. A serial killer was on the loose. Who was he and why he was killing those young girls? The killer was given the name by the media, the Green River Killer. Welcome back to Prison Stories. In this video, we will discuss one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, the Green River Killer. A man who evaded capture for nearly 2 decades while leaving behind a trail of victims. On July 15, 1982, a 16-year-old girl named Wendy Caulfield was reported missing. Days later, her body was found floating in Washington's Green River near the Kent Des Moines Bridge. She had been strangled with her own underwear. At first, investigators had little to go on, but before they could fully process the crime, another body surfaced and then another. Within weeks, 4 more women were found in or near the river. They were Deborah Bonner, Marcia Chapman, Cynthia Hines, and Opal Mills, all with eerily similar circumstances. They were young, vulnerable, and had been strangled before being discarded like trash. With these many bodies discovered in a matter of weeks, law enforcement knew they were dealing with a serial killer. But catching him was far more difficult than they expected. The first challenge was a lack of forensic evidence. The killer had carefully chosen his victims, mostly sex workers and runaways. Their disappearances went unnoticed for days, sometimes weeks, making it nearly impossible to track their last known movements. By the time their bodies were discovered, any potential clues had been washed away by the river or destroyed by the elements. Desperate for leads, investigators questioned anyone who might have had contact with the victims. Pimps, taxi drivers, and known criminals were interrogated, but none of them matched the killer's pattern. Every promising lead quickly turned into another dead end. With no suspects in the murders continuing, FBI had to get involved. Criminal profilers believed the Green River Killer was someone who blended into society, an ordinary man who lived a double life. Without a name or a face, all they could do was wait for the killer to make a mistake. And he wouldn't, at least not for a very long time. As months passed, the bodies kept appearing. Women continued to vanish from Seattle's red light districts, only to be found weeks or months later, dumped near rivers, wooded areas, and remote locations. The killer had developed a pattern: strangulation, body disposal near water, and leaving multiple victims in clusters. But despite recognizing this pattern, police were no closer to identifying him. Police started compiling a list of possible suspects. Men who had been seen with victims, had histories of violence, or acted suspiciously around the investigation. Many were questioned, and among them was Gary Ridgway. Ridgway, a local truck painter, had been questioned after a woman reported a disturbing encounter with him. He was known to frequent areas where the victims were last seen and had even been arrested for soliciting prostitution. Police interviewed him, but he seemed cooperative and even passed a polygraph test. Without hard evidence, they had no choice but to let him go. Years passed, and the case started growing cold. The Green River Killer had perfected his method. He blended into society avoided suspicion, and continued taking lives. And for nearly 2 decades, he remained just out of reach. But in the early 2000s, everything changed. A new forensic tool would finally bring Gary Ridgway down. And that tool was DNA testing. For years, the Green River Task Force had collected physical evidence like fibers, saliva, and microscopic traces left on the victims. Without advanced forensic technology, none of it could be used to identify the killer. That changed in 2001. DNA testing had advanced significantly, and detectives decided to re-examine old evidence. And result was irrefutable. Gary Ridgway was their Green River killer, the man they let go years back after a negative polygraph test. On November 30th, 2001, police arrested Ridgway outside the truck factory where he had worked for years. The Green River killer had finally been caught, but what was his story and why all these murders? Gary Ridgway sat in an interrogation room, facing the detectives who had spent years hunting him. He didn't appear the stereotypical evil, but he wasn't nervous either.
How are you? Pretty good.
He was just a man next door, living with his family. His wife had no idea she was living with a serial killer. What struck investigators was his calm and composed demeanor. He accepted everything, even more what investigators didn't even know yet. So, what was his story? Ridgway spoke in depth about his childhood. His descriptions painted a picture of a troubled upbringing. He described his mother as dominant and aggressive, often belittling his father and controlling every aspect of the household. His father worked as a bus driver and frequently talked about his disdain for sex workers, a detail that may have influenced Ridgway's later choice of victims. Ridgway claimed his mother humiliated him as a child, particularly during bedwetting incidents. Some psychologists believe this early exposure to shame and confusion around sexuality played a role in his later violent impulses toward women. Despite his struggles, Ridgway grew up to be outwardly normal. He was married multiple times and even had a son. However, behind this ordinary exterior, he was already leading a double life, frequenting sex workers and harboring a growing urge to kill. Ridgway himself never fully explained why he became a murderer, but he admitted that his need for control, his resentment toward women, and his desire to eliminate sex workers all played a role. His childhood, marked by domination, shame, and emotional detachment, may have shaped the man who would later become the Green River Killer. He showed all early signs of a troubled child, breaking windows, starting fires, killing animals, so much that his first murder was in his teenage. But as he grew older, he knew how to hide his violent side from the world and look normal. But that was not all he confessed. What was actually chilling was his murder details. He admitted to killing at least 71 women, or maybe more. For 20 years, he has been killing women, and now he couldn't even remember all their names. He described how he chose his victims, mostly sex workers and runaways. Women he believed no one would notice missing. He would lure them into his truck, gain their trust, then strangle them, often using his bare hands. He sometimes returned to the dump sites to move the bodies or engage with them in disturbing ways. He was almost addicted to necrophilia. There wasn't any remorse. His lack of emotion stunned detectives. He spoke about the murders as if they were routine, insignificant events. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Ridgway agreed to a plea deal. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he cooperated with investigators, leading them to additional remains and revealing details about his crimes.
I just drove in my pickup and camper and parked it, brought her body over and put it a little bit over the hill.
is.
What was shocking was his admission that victims didn't mean anything for him as an individual. He didn't remember their names or who they were. All he could tell was where he dumped them. On November 5th, 2003, Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of murder, making him the most prolific convicted serial killer in U.S. history at the time. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even behind bars, the true extent of his crimes remains unknown. To this day, authorities believe the real number of victims could be much higher. Ridgway may have a difficult childhood, but that does not justify his crimes. Even with his conviction, questions remain. He himself admitted he lost count of how many women he killed. For the families of those still missing, there is no closure. Only the lingering possibility that their loved ones were among his unknown victims. Thank you for watching Prison Stories. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime documentaries.